Amidst a dense, suffocating fog, the Battle of Lützen rages on. The mist is so thick that visibility is reduced to a mere 4 meters. The battlefield is a grim spectacle, littered with the bodies of thousands of dead and wounded soldiers. The Swedish front line is faltering, being relentlessly pushed back. In the chaos, a critical gap has opened up between the infantry in the center, leaving them vulnerable to a fierce attack by the Imperial cavalry. The situation is dire. In this moment of desperation, King Gustavus Adolphus makes a fateful decision. He takes the bold step to personally lead a charge to rescue the right flank. The king gets separated with a small entourage and disappears in the fog.
Where's the king? I'm the king! Your Majesty!
It's 1632. For 14 years, the 30-year war has been raging in Europe. Under the reign of Gustav II Adolphus, Sweden entered the war 1630 with great success. After the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Gustavus Adolphus marched against southern Germany. This area could supply his army and threaten the Catholic League. After the fall of Munich in May 1632, Gustavus was at the height of his power in Germany. Within 1 year, he had moved the theatre of war from Pomerania in the north to Bayern in the south. It looked like Austria and Vienna might be in danger as well. The Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II now put Albrecht von Wallenstein in charge of the army. This was not the first time he held this position in the 30 Years' War. He had previously been discharged by the emperor. Wallenstein quickly recruited another army and aimed to attack where the Protestant League was weak. He chose the Saxons in Bohemia. An army under the Saxon king Johann Georg had tried to attack Austria but failed. Wallenstein chased this Saxon army and Prague was swiftly captured. And now King Gustavus' army was threatened. If Saxony fell, the Swedish army could be trapped and cut off by 2 Austrian armies led by Wallenstein and by Duke Maximilian. Gustavus wanted to prevent the 2 imperial armies from combining and not lose the vital supply line to the north, and thus a march north was the only solution. The army marched to Nuremberg. Gustavus failed to prevent the 2 imperial armies from combining. Suddenly, his 18,000 men stood against 40,000 to 50,000 Catholics. A standoff began that lasted the whole summer. Wallenstein wanted to starve the Swedish army, whilst Gustavus waited for reinforcements. At the end of August, the Swedish army had gathered 45,000 men and 175 cannons. The Swedish army tried to break through the Wallenstein's army and continue north. In the Battle of Altefeste, the Swedish army failed to capture Wallenstein's position, which forced Gustavus to march his army south again. In the beginning of September, Gustavus marched towards South Germany in an attempt to lure Wallenstein to move towards him. The plan failed. Instead, Wallenstein then turned his troops towards Saxony and their king Johann Georg. The kingdom was better suited to supply Wallenstein's army, and he also hoped to sway the Saxon king to his side. This forced Gustavus to turn north again and chase Wallenstein. The Swedish army was too small to meet Wallenstein's army. But in October, a sufficient number of troops had been gathered after joining forces with the army of Bernhard of Sachsen-Weimar. Now the Swedish army could attack Wallenstein, but they waited, waiting for Wallenstein to make a strategic mistake, which also happened. Wallenstein thought the campaign season was over and started to look where to put his army in winter quarters, according to the military thinking of the time. Thinking that the Swedish army was far away and would not dare to attack without the Saxon army, Wallenstein, in the beginning of November 1632, ordered his army to split into different forces. One part was sent away under General Pappenheim towards the city of Hall. When the Swedish army received a report of Wallenstein's mistake, no time was wasted. The Swedish marched towards Wallenstein to engage him in battle. On the 5th of November, the Swedish army began its march towards Lützen and Wallenstein. Gustavus wanted the battle to begin even before Wallenstein sent for Pappenheim. But Wallenstein already knew that the Swedish army was on the march. A small force commanded by a certain Colloredo had discovered the marching Swedes at Rippach, 6 kilometers from Wallenstein's camp at Lützen. A small skirmish broke out between the two forces, which delayed the Swedish advance by a few hours. Wallenstein used this time to send messages to Pappenheim to rejoin the main army. Pappenheim received the message in the middle of the night between the 5th and 6th of November. "The enemy is marching towards us. Your Excellency must drop everything and hurry here with all the people and cannons to be here with us early in the morning." At 2 a.m., Pappenheim together with his cavalry rode towards Lützen. The infantry and cannons would follow at first light. Now a race of time began. If the Swedes managed to attack in the morning of 6th of November, Wallenstein would be forced to fight the Swedish army without Pappenheim. In the early morning, a heavy fog covered the whole field at Lützen, which blocked the view both for the Swedish and Imperial troops. This delayed the battle for several hours. The time started to run out for the Swedes, as Pappenheim, with each passing hour, came closer to Lützen. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The Swedes started to form up for battle at 5 a.m., but they were delayed by a heavy fog that had placed itself over Lützen. Around 8 to 9 a.m., the Swedish army formed a battle line. In the fields of Lützen, two armies stood. Gustavus' army numbered around 19,000 men, while Wallenstein managed to gather a force numbered 16 to 17,000 men. But if Pappenheim joined forces, it would increase with another 5 to 6,000 men and thus gain a numerical advantage. The Swedish army had many more cannons than the Imperial army, 60 to be exact. The Imperial army only had 23 cannons, but the numeral disadvantage was compensated that they had placed the majority of the cannons on a small height next to 3 windmills. This position was also deeply entrenched. The main Imperial army formed on the west side of the road going toward Leipzig. The city of Lützen was surrounded by gardens. These gardens were walled off by man-high dirt obstacles. These positions were used by Wallenstein as ideal positions for musketeers that would easily fire upon the marching Swedish army. The Imperial army was led by Wallenstein, who personally led the center. Colloredo led the right, next to the city of Lützen. Field Marshal Hendrik Holk led the left flank. The army formed 3 lines, front and back with a reserve. In front of the line, musketeers were positioned in the ditches next to the road. The cavalry was concentrated on the flanks. Historians are unsure what Wallenstein's plan was, but many agree that the most likely plan was that Wallenstein would hold his position until Pappenheim arrived and then attack the Swedish army. The Swedish formation was 2 lines, front and back, with a small reserve behind these lines. The Swedish left was led by Bernard of Sachsen-Weimar. The center was led by Niels Brahe, leading the green, blue, yellow and the Swedish brigade, and the right by the king himself. The cavalry on the right consisted only of Swedish forces. The second line was commanded by Knyphausen. One thing that caused concern was the terrain. The lack of space forced the Swedish right to deploy closer to the enemy. While waiting for the fog to clear, sermons were held all over the Swedish army. Gustavus Adolphus held a private sermon with the field chaplain Dr. Fabricius. After that, Gustavus held 2 speeches to his soldiers, one in Swedish and the other one in German. In the first speech, he turned towards the Swedish and Finnish troops. "Brave brothers, make sure to conduct yourself bravely this day. Fight fearlessly for God's word and your king, and receive God's mercy and worldly honor. I will truly reward you, but if you do otherwise, I swear that your bones will never return to Sweden." The Swedish army had to wait even longer before the fog had cleared enough for them to start the attack. At 10 a.m., the king ordered the attack to begin. Drums and trumpets sounded and thousands of men started to walk into the uncertain future. Gustavus ordered a few pieces of artillery to open fire. It was answered by a few shots from the Imperial side, and the first death occurred. It was a horse. At this time, Wallenstein ordered Lützen to be put on fire, and the smoke made its way into the fog and over the battlefield right into the Swedish lines. The smoke was now so thick that you could only see 4 steps in front of you. Gustavus turned towards the sky and shouted with full force, "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus, help me fight today!" At 11 a.m., under the command of Gustavus, the Swedish right swiftly passed the road and started to chase the Imperial musketeers on the right and capture ground. General Stålhandske, who led the right flank under Gustavus, managed to advance quite far on the right flank as the Croats fled without much of a fight. Imperial left may break. The Swedish center reached the road under heavy bombardment from the Imperial artillery, tearing up huge gaps in the Swedish lines. The infantry then crossed the road and cleansed the road trench from the remaining musketeers. The Swedish and Yellow Brigade managed to advance and capture some of the Imperial artillery. At the same time, the Green Brigade moved slowly under artillery fire from the hill and musket fire from the front and from the left. Many Swedes were saved by the fog, which for once gave the Swedish an advantage. Although a fortified house in front of the hill caused a significant obstacle for the Swedish forces. The Swedish cavalry on the left had managed to advance far beyond the road and threaten the Imperial forces with envelopment. Thus, the first goal of the Swedish plan was a success. Every Imperial counterattack failed and were repelled by the Swedish fire. Another hour passed without any side gaining the upper hand, but on the Swedish right flank, under Gustavus, the Swedes advanced and the Imperial cavalry suffered heavy losses from the Swedish fire and threatened Wallenstein's left flank. The Swedish victory was within reach. Then suddenly, at noon, Pappenheim's cavalry arrived, around 2,000 men. These fresh troops countered the Swedish attack on the Imperial left and pressed them back. While this was taking place, Pappenheim had sent a few hundreds of Croatian cavalry around the Swedish lines to attack the camp, but they were later fought off by the rear guard. But Pappenheim was mortally wounded, and the charge lost its momentum, and troops started to flee. Pappenheim was later sent away and soon died, but for now, he was still in the battle. Wallenstein, with renewed energy, attacked the whole Swedish line. During this heavy fighting, the Swedish center started to falter. A new charge under Piccolomini on the Swedish brigade caused them to retreat. Wallenstein's attack pushed the Swedish left and center all the way back across the road. The Swedish center consisted of veterans. One officer said that the Swedish line only held and retreated in good order because the veterans had forgotten how to retreat. In a matter of minutes, many of the veterans were slaughtered. It was now around 12:30 p.m. The Swedes were losing the battle, and the Swedish line was almost broken under the weight of the Imperial attack. The Swedish forces needed a resolute action. It forced the king to personally take charge of an attack. Together with a cavalry regiment consisting of Swedes, he rode towards the heavy fighting to try to turn the tide of the battle. This weakened Wallenstein's left flank once again. This made the whole situation critical, as the Swedes were given the chance to split Wallenstein's main army from Pappenheim's troops. Luckily for the Imperials, Piccolomini's heavy cuirassiers was near and could save the situation on the left flank yet again. But during the chaotic battle, few knew where the king was. He was nowhere to be seen. The Imperial army could not use its success against the Swedish veterans in the center. The fog was still thick on the battlefield. The Imperial center also suffered heavy losses and was under constant fire from the Swedish artillery. Wallenstein ordered the Imperial troops to hold their positions. After recovering and refilling the gaps in the lines, they redeployed to the trenches next to the road again. The king was still lost on the right flank, as few of the officers and generals knew where the king was, and even fewer of the common soldiers. The battle went on. Discipline, psalm singing, and reserves contributed to the Swedish troops being able to hold the line. Weimar on the Swedish left began a second attack on the Imperial right. With reinforcement from Knyphausen's second line, the advance began, and supported by heavy Swedish artillery, the Swedes could attack with renewed and relentless charge against the Imperials. Weimar's attack actually managed to push the Imperials back. The Imperial right was already weakened before the Swedish charge, as regiments had fled before the attack. Wallenstein rode between the Imperial regiments, trying his best to keep order and discipline within the ranks. But the Swedes pushed them back, and together with the Swedish cavalry, Wallenstein was almost surrounded by the Swedish troops. But during this critical moment, Pappenheim's reinforcements finally joined the Imperial right flank, and they were put precisely where Wallenstein needed them. The numbers now were on the Imperial side, and they pushed the Swedish advance back again with such a force that the Swedish left almost dissolved. The Swedish right, under command of Stålhandske, attacked the Imperial right, but under the leadership of Holk, the Imperial forces slowed down the Swedish advance. At this critical moment, Stålhandske received news that stopped the Swedish momentum on the right. The king Gustavus Adolphus was dead. From 1:30 p.m. and the following hour, the Swedish line looked like it would break. The Swedish brigades in the center were heavily weakened. 2 were not in fighting shape. The Swedish right stood still after they lost the king, and Weimar's advance was stopped and was pushed back. Still, the news of the king's death had only reached Stålhandske. The king's priest, Dr. Fabricius, had seen the king ride off into the mist and watched Småland's cavalry come back without him. Then suddenly, a horse without a rider came racing across the battlefield in front of the Swedish troops. The officers recognized it straight away. It was the king's horse. Rumors began to spread in the Swedish lines, causing even more damage to the already severe situation. Dr. Fabricius found and asked the Småländska riders what had happened with the king, but was met with only silence. A priest among the riders then answered, "Rex vulneratus est." The king is wounded. The Swedish army was still in full crisis. At this moment, Knyphausen, a seasoned veteran of many battles, kept calm. With his experience, he managed to keep the first and second line from breaking out in panic. By taking command of the center and right, he stabilized the Swedish lines and kept them in the fight. Units from the first line were allowed to position themselves behind the second line to regroup, while Knyphausen sent forces to Brahe to reinforce the gaps in the first line. At 2 p.m., with Knyphausen's reinforcements, the Swedish regained the Imperial battery next to the road. The Swedes turned them against the former owner and started to fire. The Swedes used the fight to push the Imperial left back again. But the Swedish right was not in any condition to use this success. Stålhandske had now left his command of the Swedish right flank to personally search for the king. Then, around 3 p.m., Stålhandske, together with his troops, found Gustavus Adolphus dead in the mud, stripped of every belonging except a few shirts and socks, bloody and his face down in the mud. A wagon was brought forth, and in the utmost secrecy the body was transported to a nearby church, where the body was given last rites. When the report arrived close to 3 p.m, it was confirmed that the king had fallen. Bernard of Sachsen-Weimar took charge of the Swedish army, according to what had been agreed before the battle. He quickly reassesses the battle situation. At this point, the situation was critical. Weimar decides with all remaining forces to go on the attack yet again. While preparing for the next attack, a calmness set over the battlefield, only the cannons continuing their fire. The two armies had no longer any contact with each other. During 30 minutes, both sides regrouped. The Swedish forces regrouped where they had begun the attack in the morning, beyond the reach of the Imperial cannons. The Swedes now put their last reserves on the line. The fog had now become manageable, and the Swedes could now see the Imperial forces. The Imperials were not sure what was going on, but they also used the pause to regroup their forces. Many of Wallenstein's forces thought they had won the battle. Large numbers of the new Swedish line forming up was beyond the sight of the Imperials, so scouts were sent to find out what was going on. They returned with grim news. The enemy is on their way towards us in full battle order, in just as good formation as during the first attack. Wallenstein now realized that a renewed Swedish advance was on the way, and the regrouped forces were sent forward. and the last reserves were put forward. When the Swedes saw the new and fresh troops, they thought Pappenheim's infantry had arrived. But in reality, they were 2 to 3 hours away. With a heavy artillery bombardment from both sides, the Swedish advance began. On the left flank, the Swedish attacked the Imperial right on the hill with the windmills. The Imperial center was under heavy pressure. The Swedish cavalry on the right threw Piccolomini back and split him from Wallenstein's army, and thus threatened his left. Wallenstein now saw how his troops started to crumble, even as he ordered failed counterattacks. But Wallenstein was able to regroup his left flank and make the center retreat in order. Colorado's position was holding. The Swedish Green Brigade attacked the hill with the windmills again. Heavy fighting broke out, and the Swedes were successful and conquered the windmills on the hill together with the Imperial cannons. But it was now 5 p.m. and darkness started to fall across the battlefield and made it impossible to continue the successful attack on the left flank. With the darkness of night, a silence spread through the fields of Lützen. The sound of war was replaced by an eerie silence. The Imperial army retreated a few hundred meters beyond the hill with the windmills. Around 6 p.m., Pappenheim's infantry arrived, 2,700 men. Yet again the numbers were in the Imperial favor, but Wallenstein feared that the Swedish Saxon forces were marching on Lützen and would arrive during the night and cut off his retreat. He didn't want to continue the battle. At 7 p.m., Wallenstein ordered the retreat. In good order, the Imperial army retreated to Leipzig. The Swedes, who had also considered a retreat, all of a sudden stood alone on the battlefield, too tired to follow Wallenstein's army. The Swedish losses numbered between 4,600 to 5,100 men, killed or wounded. The Imperial army was around 3,000 to 4,000 killed or wounded. The Swedes conquered all of the 24 Imperial cannons and 45 Imperial standards. But one question remains. How did Gustavus Adolphus really die? The king, together with 6 other men, Duke Franz Albert of Sachsen-Lauenburg, von der Schulenburg, August von Läufeling, and Anders Jönsson, sprinted his horse into the fog towards the remaining Swedish cavalry on the right. The king gathers the Swedish cavalry, Smålands regiment. The king began his charge on the right flank. The charge was a success at the beginning. They once more crossed the road. The king, being nearsighted, tries desperately to differentiate between friend and foe. Out of the fog, a projectile nudges against the king's horse's throat and hits the king in the elbow, splitting the bone in his arm into 2 parts. He drops his sword and desperately tries to control his horse. The charge continued, but the king together with his entourage retreated. The Swedish cavalry then met Piccolomini's cuirassiers. Heavy fighting broke out, and the Swedish cavalry, without leadership, was cut through by the Imperials and forced back across the road. In the fog, the king was weakened, shocked, and only with a small entourage. It didn't help that he had only wore light leather clothing, because an old battle wound made it impossible for him to wear a metal harness. The king called Duke Franz Albert to help them get out of the fog back to the Swedish lines. The king's horse was calmed and led by von der Schulenburg. But all of a sudden, in the thick fog, black cuirassiers blow their way through the grey wall, according to some sources being led by Moritz von Falkenberg, or at least he was a part of the unit. This group of riders recognized Gustavus immediately and charged at him, according to some sources shouting, "Here we have the right bird. It is him we are looking for." Heavy fighting broke out between the 2 groups. Then one rider fired a shot that hit the king in the back under the shoulder blade, but the rider was quickly killed by von der Schulenburg. The king then received a strike from a sword in his chest, one in the arm and one in the back. The king's entourage tried to get the king back over the road, but the king is weak and has a hard time staying in the saddle. Duke Franz and von Schulenburg tried to keep the king in his saddle, but that was not easy as the king was heavily overweight. Duke Franz Albert was hit by a bullet on the cheek and he let go of the king. Gustavus fell out of his saddle. but his foot got stuck in the stirrup and he was dragged a few meters before the foot got untangled and he hit the ground hard. Anders Jensen and Läufeling stayed at the king's side. The remaining men of the king's entourage were forced to flee, being heavily outnumbered, leaving their king behind. The bodyguard Anders Jensen was struck many times and killed trying to protect his king. The 18-year-old Läufeling tried to lift the king onto his horse, but was not able to lift the king due to his weight. Then the imperial cuirassiers rode up to Läufeling and asked who this man on the ground was. Läufeling refused to answer, or he said it was only an officer. Läufeling was then mortally wounded by the Imperials and fell over. One of the cuirassiers, who suspected the king was an important man, dismounted and asked Gustavus who he was. Gustavus then answered, "I am the king of Sweden." But then a small Swedish cavalry unit came rushing towards the Imperial cavalry. One of the riders pulled his gun and shot Adolphus in the temple. The Imperial unit fled the scene, but not before plundering the body of the king of everything including his shirt, the leather coat, jewelry and socks. We have this detailed account as Läufeling survived another 9 days, during which he told this before he died, but the whole truth of Gustavus Adolphus was lost in the fog at Lützen. In the autopsy of the royal body, it showed that Gustavus was hit at least by 5 bullets and 3 to 4 stabs from a blade. The Battle of Lützen is one of the most famous battles in the world. Gustavus Adolphus, also known as the Lion from the North, had reached the end of his life. The lion would return to his kingdom in a coffin. The war would continue to 1648 and end with the genesis of the Empire of Sweden. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment.